Thank you so much, Brother Kenny, for sticking with that time. Really appreciate that. Reverend Rudolph Boshoff, can you hear us?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes, we can
Fantastic.
hear you now. I'm just going to set the timer now.
Fantastic. Well, let me.
So I'm not going to. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. No, let me say thanks, Kenny, for your presentation. Before I start with mine, I had to chop and change a little, as I was more focused on the actual attributes of Yahweh versus Allah. But I don't mind. It's fine. We can take it from there. So please let me know, Mohammed, when I can start, and I'll start my clock as well.
Yeah, sure. As soon as you start, I'll press the start button on my timer. So you can feel free to start now.
Thank you so much, guys. Well, thank you so much, Kenny. That is a really interesting study. And again, whenever we come to the text and whenever we are trying to discover different opinions and different hypotheses, I enjoy it. Being a scholar myself, I first of all need to say that obviously I prepared for something a little bit different, but this is also welcome. Well, let me just start off, first of all, with the assumption of similarities that can be seen as direct parallels. And I think it was very appropriate in H. Ringinger in his article, Israel's Place Amongst the Religions of the Ancient Near East, who writes the following, and he speaks of the common acumen that is being deduced because of people looking at these different background texts, especially when we look at some of the sources that Kenny have mentioned. He basically comes and he says that comparative research in the biblical field has often come up with a kind of a parallel hunting, where there is the assumption that once it has been established that a certain biblical expression or a custom has a parallel outside of the Bible, the whole problem of the Old Testament is seen as being or regarded as being solved. When we look at some of these extra biblical parallels and how they are deduced, I think it is safe to say that this is usually stemming from the documentary hypothesis, which is the JEDP documentary hypothesis, which was obviously made popular by the religious school in Germany quite a long time ago in the early 18th century. But the Old Testament scholar Dwayne Garrett, who's written a book called Rethinking Genesis, he writes about the documentary hypothesis. I also did an interview with another lady on the SATS website where we look at the documentary hypothesis and we refute it quite substantially. And Dwayne Garrett goes on and he says the following. He says, a creature stalks the halls of biblical studies. It is routinely raised up from the grave in classrooms as it haunts textbooks and monographs that deal with the Hebrew scriptures. Wherever it roams, it distorts the analysis of the text of the Bible, confounds readers, and produces strange and irrational interpretations. Listen to what it says about the JEDP theory and the documentary hypothesis. This undead creature sometimes go by the quasi-mystical sounding sobriquet called the JEDP theory, but it's better known by its formal name as the documentary hypothesis. The time has come for scholars to recognize that the documentary hypothesis is dead, and the arguments that support it have been dismantled by scholars of many stripes, many who have no theological commitment to the Bible. Okay, so when I look at the assumption that Israel in and of itself was monolatrous, we can refer to several scholars like Dr. Larry Hurtado, the late Dr. Larry Hurtado, who was a good friend, Dr. Richard Balcom, who all speak of ancient Jewish monotheism as something being strict. That being said, though, there are certain allowances, and we will look at that for some of the things that Kenny maybe have mentioned. So if you look, for instance, at the JPS Torah commentary on Deuteronomy that was published by the Jewish Publication Society, and you look at Hebrew scholars like Yetzel Kaufman and the American archaeologists like W.F. Albright, there is quite a few concerns and quite a few conversation points that we can obviously deduce when we look at some of the theories that Kenny has just deduced. First of all, they mention quite clearly that from the Bible and from archaeological evidence, we can see quite clearly that Israel was, even in its earliest inception, a de facto monotheistic religion ever since the time from Moses. That being said, we can also see that there was definitely some interaction in some of the biblical reflexes, as they call it, with some of the other worshipping of mention or worshipping of other gods. But even in that, we can see that there's only a veneration of some of the images. Usually there is an interaction with God through his prophets, or even him by himself, looking at these authentic paganisms that are relevant to Israel. And what happens is that even though a number of people worship some of these supposed statues, they were always placed back into scope of Yahweh, him bringing condemnation, him bringing his prophets, and him speaking quite emphatically about the idolatry. Also interesting, if you look at the presumed idolatry that was in Israel, you can see quite clearly that it was the reports of the kings themselves, who, due to political reasons, connected some of their practices to foreign policies, and they interacted with some of these other religious constitutes and religious groups and entities. So also archaeological evidence, especially if we look at polytheism amongst the Jewish belief system, especially under ancient Near Eastern, cultures, we can see quite clearly, though, that there was always going back to what is known as a Mosaic monotheism. So when we look at Israeli inscriptions, when we look at some of these little figurines that have been discovered in archaeology, we can see quite clearly that there is no emphatic paradigm given that Israel in and of themselves took on what is described in the Ugaritic text, and also what is described emphatically and explicitly in the polytheistic system of religious beliefs. That being said, we will deal with how these things crept in and why certain elements in the biblical text were used that might sound Canaanite in its essence. Let me just give you a comment from Sir William Albright, where he speaks of Mosaic monotheism. And he says the following. He says, like that of the following centuries, at least down to the 7th century, that is BCE, there was a practical and implicit rather than intellectual and explicit understanding of Israel, where they enacted like monotheists, meaning that there was always a drift back towards that understanding of monotheism and the practice of religious constitutes and faith as it is assumed in the biblical scriptures. Now, again, I've recently read Robert Wright's book on the evolution of religions, and there was a reason for it. In actual fact, I've connected with Dr. Winfried Gordon and looked at his evolutionary approach to world religions. And let me start off and say that when we look at Robert Wright, he is a Buddhist, and he's a humanist anthropologist. And humanist anthropology obviously stands on the shoulders of the evolutionary approach that Kenny mentions. And when we look at this approach, we need to understand that in this approach, there's almost an undermining and almost a negation of some or any form of supernatural influence. That being said, there's a few problems with the evolutionary approach to religions. And the biggest problem, according to Dr. Gordon, is that the evolutionary model of religion in and of itself have never really been emphatically observed in history. So that being said, there's a lot of chance that the religious life of many cultures, even though there are certain instances where they are, vacillating between what should be known as polytheism, henotheism, and monotheism, it can go any way around, and that evolutionary model cannot speak of a natural progression or even an adaptation, as we've seen it being demonstrated by the very core tenets or beliefs of this very given system. So with the demonstration of successive and different cultures, we can see that there is very little validation historically that grant the evolutionary pattern religion really this credence that is looked for when it speaks of these in given similarities. So what do we make about where the Israelites, in actual fact, have vacillated and have gone basically from what should be deemed a monotheistic system to a monolitary system? Well, we can definitely identify and see quite clearly that from the standpoint of Jewish tradition, especially, which accepts that the Pentateuch was obviously transmitted by Moses in its entirety around 3,300 years ago, that there was always a monotheistic, like I said, tendency. We can see it in scriptures like Deuteronomy 4:35, where there is the instance given that there is only one God and there is no God beside him. And then also we can see, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 44 verse 6, God speaks emphatically and he says, I'm the first, I'm the last, and besides me there are no other gods. So it is evident from, and I can go into other texts as well, from certain passages that these passages referring, especially to the singular understanding of Yahweh, is emphatically looking to dispose of any other mention of other supposed deities, which is obviously implied in the biblical text and in other mythologies. So when we look at Israel in and of itself, are they trying to enact what we see merely by Canaanite religions? Again, we should say that there are instances, if you read the Old Testament, you can see quite clearly that there are periods when many Jews abandoned their Judaistic faith, and sometimes they went after other deities or gods, which is obviously mentioned as false gods. One mention of that is found in 1 Kings chapter 18, where we can see where some of these individuals exhibited what is known as a monolatristic belief, which was obviously a departure from what is known as normative Judaism in the Bible. But it's important to note that we do not deny that there was a similar imagery or interaction with other deified figures, which was around the dispensation by which Israel became enticed by these religions. That is exactly what we see. There's an adaptation, there is an integration, and there's a leaning on some of these parallels and some of these imageries. But the imageries is utilized, and even though these images are utilized, we should not speak of them as direct parallels, because they simply are adaptations. And again, similarities do not prove, once more, direct parallels. So what do we make of these supposed tensions between Yahweh and El, or as some people would say, Elohim? I think Gleason Archer, in his book, A Survey of the Old Testament Introduction, gives a wonderful explanation of the difference in the distribution of what is mentioned between Yahweh and Elohim, especially when it comes to the Torah. Gleason Archer says the following. He says, a careful study of the etymology and the usage of the two names indicates that the names chosen were dependent upon any of the context and given situation. First of all, Elohim is referred to as God, as the almighty creator of the universe, or the Lord over nature and man, in a kind of a general way. It is usually appropriated in scriptures like Genesis 1, since the subject there dealt with creation. Yahweh, on the other hand, is the covenant name of God, which is reserved for situations in which some covenant engagement with God is involved. These distinctions between the two names of God was clearly perceived and redefined by some of the Jewish scholars as long ago as the 12th century Anno Domini, when we can see that Elohim was given as the divine name in general, where Adonai or Yahweh specifically spoke of the revelation of God in his covenant. So the tension of the name between El and Yahweh, which is evident in other Canaanite religions, we do not deny, but what we do deny is the practice and the use of the name, which is evident in the Israeli milieu. Eventually, scholars like Marvin H. Pope, he actually wrote a whole book on El in the Ugaritic texts. He agrees with Abram Kunin. Abram Kunin wrote another book called the Hexateuch, and he concedes when he looks at the evidence between the Jewish and the Canaanite understanding of El and Yahweh. He says the history of critical investigation has shown that far too much weight has often been laid on the agreement in the use of some of these divine names. It is well, therefore, to utter a warning against laying an exaggerated stress on such phenomena. In other words, when we look at the way these words and these entities and their ascriptions were used, we should be very careful. Even a scholar, Ivan Engel, that wrote Gamla Testamente, also writes, and he says the following. He says the different divine names have different ideological associations, especially within the Jewish mindset. Yahweh is really used in question to Israel's nationality as their given God, while on the other hand, Elohim gives more the expression of a theological abstract or a cosmic picture of God in a larger or more moving context. There's no doubt. And again, if we come to the conflation of the issue that have been mentioned between El, which is the high God, and Yahweh, that was the son of El, or the supreme of the Canaanite deity, the higher God, and how this God basically worked himself up in his constitutes. My friend and scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser, actually wrote quite an extensive article about this. And I would, if you want to go into great detail with that, unfortunately, I don't have time. But he wrote an article called Are Yahweh and El Distinct Deities, especially in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, and Psalm 82, which is obviously also some of the scriptures that would be used. Okay, so what do we make of these plural instances in, for instance, the Old Testament, where we can see quite clearly that there's an interaction between Yahweh and also Elohim, especially in the divine council, maybe in passages like Psalm 82, where the gods, Elohim, are mentioned in the Old Testament? Well, I think it's safe to say that when we look at Psalm 82, there is a unanimous agreement, especially from Old Testament scholarship, that this is obviously a polemic used against the Ugaritic gods. And again, when we look at the interaction of Psalm 82, I'm not going to go into how Jesus explains it in the New Testament, but let me rather try to explain to you exactly what is described when we can see that the Lord in Psalm 82 is presiding over the divine assembly of the gods, like I said, which sounds very like the Canaanite polytheistic themes. So, since the Bible affirms that there's only one true God, we can, from a biblical perspective, and especially a Jewish perspective, assume that it is not speaking necessarily of a plethora of gods, or even a henotheistic understanding, or a monotheistic understanding of these gods. The Bible frequently mentions other gods the pagans worship, but makes it clear that they were lifeless and they were powerless idols. We see this quite clearly in scriptures like Psalm 96:5, 154-7, also in Isaiah 46, I think, verse 1-2. Paul even mentions this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 19, and also 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. So the term gods or Elohim in this psalm, especially Psalm 82, could be taken in its generic sense of the strength and might and something that have been reserved or to powerful men or judges of the earth, or even through the eyes of my friend Mike Heiser, through the revelation of some demonic forces, which were obviously venerated and worshipped. But this should never be understood as being a resolve given where there was a confusion or even a ascension in the Jewish understanding or milieu surrounding the high God. So when you read something like, for instance, Mark A. Smith, his book on the origins of biblical monotheism, where he, for instance, speaks of the Ugaritic motif and the seven sons of El and Athirat, we should understand that Mark also says quite clearly that when we look at the meaning of the word divinity in the ancient Near East, we should consider them in how they instinctively apply to when we want and to when and what we speak when we mention Yahweh and El. Also, Margaret Baker was mentioned. In actual fact, I've got a book of her in my library here that is based on Alan F. Siegel's book, The Two Powers in Heaven. And it's actually quite exciting to see that Muslim studies are moving in this direction. And I would encourage, Kenny to go further in this. But she claims simply that in the pre-Christian Judaism, there was not a monotheistic root, or the monotheistic roots that were evident in Judaism were not averse to Christian Trinitarian theology, and that the pre-Christian Palestinian belief about angels, in actual fact, when it looks at the high God or the sons of God, gives us quite a clear indication or understanding of what it means when we speak about how the Trinity in the Old Testament, how it was encapsulated and how it was vested in the Old Testament. Okay, so in the Old Testament, even Jewish scholar Naum Sarna confirms quite clearly when he looks at these angels and the expressions of this plurality of Yahweh in the Old Testament that is affirmed. For instance, in the Old Testament, there are certain scriptures that get us quite excited where we can see that there is a definite plurality. For instance, the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 63, verse 9-16, speaks of the angels of his presence that is identified with Yahweh and the spirit of Yahweh and then also Yahweh himself, all three in one chapter, yet there is a understanding that it is still that one God. That is definitely something that is not foreign to Judaism. And therefore, the Israeli scholar YHWH Kaufman says quite clearly that, when we look at the numeric understanding of the one God in Israel, they were never concerned with a numeric understanding of Yahweh. They were simply understanding that there was, as Margaret Baker says, the plurality of Yahweh in heaven, especially in passages like Genesis chapter 19, verse 23, where we can see that Yahweh is in heaven, but he rains down fire and brimstone upon Yahweh on earth. This got the attention of a Jewish scholar by the name of Benjamin Summer, and he wrote a book called The Bodies of God, The Ancient World of Israel. And there's a podcast he made, and he speaks of this plurality of God that is evident even in the Old Testament without violating God's unity, as Trinitarian Christians would assume and say. And he says when the New Testament talks about Jesus as being some sort of small-scale human manifestation of God, that really sounds to Jews utterly pagan. But what I'm actually suggesting, remember this is a Jewish scholar, is that the radical idea for us Jews that it was in fact not pagan. We Jews have always tended and sort of made fun of the Trinity. But it is, in actual fact, the idea that is deduced from the Near Eastern understanding that also functions in a monotheistic context. We Jews have no theological objection to the doctrine of the Trinity. The Trinity is as old as the ancient Near Eastern idea that shows up in the Tanakh and in different ways shows up in Jewish mysticism and other texts as well. And I can go into what Rabbi Eliezer Hakil in the 5th century said when he looks at this, but it's interesting to see quite clearly that there is definitely the assumed understanding that this was not averse to the Old Testament, and the use of these names in actual fact has a specific meaning. Now let me quickly describe in my last 4 minutes to you the meaning. We've heard it, for instance, said that from Baal to Yahweh, we can see that there is the mention, for instance, of the rider of the clouds. And that is obviously a deduction from Canaanite religions. Well, Eugene H. Merrill, in his commentary on Deuteronomy, actually suggests the opposite. He says the following. He says the imagery of Yahweh riding on the heavens and clouds, and again, if you look at it in the Ugaritic text, it speaks of the Samayin and the Seakik, and this is what Merrill says. When we look at the imagery, it is a mythopoetic anthropomorphism that is adapted. Now that sounds words, that is big, but he simply says the following. It's adapted from the pagan epic sources, but with an intensely polemic overtone against the depravity of the pagan religious conceptions. The point was, and the point has always been, when there is a use from some of these other religions that is incorporated or used from Yahweh or to El, which is the same God in the Jewish scripture, Emeliu, the point was that it was not nearly, or not really Baal or any God who rode and triumphed the heavens above, but it was the Lord Yahweh alone who did it. He was the unique and the solitary. And that is obviously affirmed in Psalm 18, verse 11, and Psalm 68, 34, and 104:3. So what am I saying? Well, I'm simply saying that we can see that there is a use of some of these languages and a use of some of these conceptions. But when we look at the use of some of these conceptions, we understand that it was done with a polemical intent to show and to prove quite clearly that the Yahweh of the scriptures, is, for a lack of a better word, using the indicative words from the pagan mythologies to create an imagery to describe the one God of Israel. Let me read to you what Mark Heiser says on this. And he spoke here, and Kenny mentioned, for instance, the Ugaritic pantheon father-like figure that appears as an old man. And that's also evident in, for instance, if you look at scriptures like Daniel chapter 7. Listen to what Mark Heiser says, and listen to the use of some of these words. Mark Heiser says the following. He says, first of all, it's important to understand that the biblical writers, though under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, followed the ordinary forms of literature that were current in the day when they wrote. If, for example, the biblical writer was describing a covenant treaty between the God of his people, his description conforms in a style of covenant treaties known elsewhere in the ancient world. To depart from this style would have seemed strange to the ancient readers. What kind of covenant treaty is this? Heiser obviously says tongue-in-cheek. And then he goes a little bit further and he says, if there's any form that is counted on familiarity with Baal to make their case that it was Yahweh and not Baal who was the heavenly king, We know this was the case since the Old Testament books actually quote from some of the Eucharistic religious texts, but notably the one that modern scholars have called, and obviously this is known as the Baal cycle, is quoted in a way as a polemic against the Baal cycle and all of these Eucharistic deities. So what are they doing? They're simply vesting Yahweh and El with the understanding of what is known in the Canaanite religions. And then these religions and deities are seen as belittled because it's only the true one God that ascends the heavens, tread the waters, and is the one that ascends all of heavens. In 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18, we can see quite clearly that it's exactly in that duel between God and the Baal worshippers on the Mount Carmel, which is actually closely associated with Ugarit geographically. God declares himself to be the true God, and he declares himself to be ultimately victorious over all of these conceptions. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've got 14 seconds left, but I hope I made sense. And like I said, I had to change a little bit of what I've prepared, and I hope it was cogent, and I hope it blessed you. Thanks.
الله أكبر.